Something significant just occurred in the Canadian House of Commons that mainstream media is largely misinterpreting. I want to clarify why this situation is more than just another political headline. It transcends the issues of Iran, drones, trade, or tariffs. What unfolded in Ottawa this week is the opening act of a much longer and potentially perilous narrative, a narrative about whether a modern democracy, a G7 nation, a founding member of NATO, and a country that helped establish the international rules-based order can maintain its sovereignty in an era when its most powerful neighbor has officially ceased to respect it. I'm observing this develop in real time, and it's crucial for you to understand exactly what happened, in what sequence, and why that sequence is vital. Because the order of events is everything. Subscribe to Sarah Mitchell's YouTube channel right now if you haven't already, as we will be immersed in this story for months. Those who grasp the architecture of what is being constructed and what is being dismantled will be the best prepared. Let's start with a word that has not been properly analyzed: never. On Tuesday, March 10, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney entered the House of Commons after adjusting his schedule to be present following days of intense criticism for his absence during a debate initiated by his own government. He stated in French, on the parliamentary record, that Canada is not participating in the United States and Israeli offensive and will never participate in it. That one word, never, carries significant weight. In the context of modern diplomacy between two deeply integrated allies sharing the longest undefended border on Earth, that word is explosive. Diplomatic language has specific terms for disagreement. Nations say, at this time, under current conditions, or we are monitoring the situation closely. They say all options remain on the table. However, what nations do not say, and what prime ministers of major allied countries do not say to their most powerful partner, is never. Never is a door that is welded shut. It is not just a position. It is a declaration of identity. What makes this word even more crucial is that Carney's position just 5 days earlier was the exact opposite. Here's how the first week of the Iran war unfolded from Ottawa's perspective. On Saturday, February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran, reportedly hitting nearly 900 targets within the first 12 hours. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. These strikes were not authorized by the United Nations Security Council, and no allied government was consulted beforehand. The war began without any communication to Ottawa. In response, Carney issued a statement expressing support for the strikes and backing U.S. actions to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. In those early hours, Canada was among the first governments to publicly endorse the operation. That is the official record of events. Then the questions began. As the dust settled and the media focused on the situation, Canadians started to wonder exactly what had transpired. A CBC News report surfaced, which would not go away. As reported by CBC's Murray Brewster on March 1st, when the U.S. and Israel launched their attack, as many as 18 members of the Canadian Armed Forces were on exchange postings with U.S. forces in Qatar and Bahrain. Not 18 observers or diplomats, but 18 military personnel embedded within the operational structures of the U.S. military, including crucially within the Combined Aerospace Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. This is the nerve center where airstrikes are coordinated and targets are selected in real time. Retired Major General Dennis Thompson, who served as a Canadian task force commander in Afghanistan and led a multinational peacekeeping force in the Sinai, stated directly to CBC News, unless the Canadian government had issued an explicit "do not engage" order, those personnel would have been actively involved in the targeting process. His words were clear. They were directly involved in targeting. The Department of National Defense denied this involvement. Defense Minister David McGuinty claimed the personnel were out of harm's way and refused to provide specifics on locations or numbers, citing operational security. However, former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy responded to that denial in the Toronto Star, writing, "You cannot embed Canadian officers in U.S. war-fighting headquarters, plug Canadian intelligence into targeting processes, then wash your hands when missiles fly." If Canadian personnel helped plan, analyze, or enable an operation, Canada is implicated whether or not a Canadian finger was on the trigger. Read that again. Not a finger on the trigger, but still implicated. This is the tension Carney was navigating, not just the political tension of an absent parliament upset with its prime minister, but the deeper legal and moral tension of a country that publicly endorsed U.S. objectives during the initial hours of an unauthorized war while its own military personnel were situated inside the targeting infrastructure. Despite this, on March 5th, while in Canberra alongside Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Carney reiterated Canada's position. As reported by Al Jazeera, he confirmed that Canada had not been consulted, calling the strikes prima facie inconsistent with international law and adding a line that would come under intense scrutiny. One can never categorically rule out participation. We will stand by our allies. The opposition in Ottawa erupted. Conservative foreign affairs critic Michael Chung labeled it an utterly incoherent position. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet accused Carney of traveling the globe like Marco Polo while Parliament was engulfed in unanswered questions. NP leader Don Davies termed the absence from Monday's debate unacceptable. Bloc Québécois House leader Christine Normandin described it as at best a pattern of disinterest in parliamentary work and accountability. Quebec Conservative MP Gérard Delt expressed the frustration of the entire chamber, asking from the House floor, "Where is the Prime Minister? Where is the Prime Minister in this arena that we call the House of Commons?" He was not present. He was attending a Ramadan iftar on Monday evening. Then, on Tuesday, he altered his schedule and walked in to declare, "Never." This is the thing about political moments that appear to be simple reversals. They rarely are. The shift from "one can never rule out participation" to "will never participate" in just 5 days is not merely a flip-flop. It represents a decision made under pressure, a calculation about which audiences matter more, and a reflection of where the domestic political center of gravity has shifted. I would argue it serves as a carefully worded signal, not just to Parliament and the Canadian public, but to every European foreign minister, every NATO ally, and every democratic government observing how Canada would respond when squeezed between Washington's demands and the rule of international law. The answer was never. Now let's examine what transpired the day before that pivotal statement, as it is not coincidental. On Monday, March 9th, 2026, one day prior to Carney's parliamentary announcement, Industry Minister Melanie Joly, Defense Minister David McGuinty, and Secretary of State for Defense Procurement Stephen Ford stood together at the National Research Council's Flight Research Lab in Ottawa, surrounded by drones, planes, and helicopters. They announced over $900 million in new investment under Canada's defense industrial strategy. As reported by CBC News, BNN Bloomberg, The Globe and Mail, and detailed on Canada.ca, the investment includes more than $500 million for drone and aerospace technologies, which encompasses a new drone innovation hub operating in Ottawa and the Mirabel area. It also includes the acquisition of a new Canadian-built Bombardier Global 6500 aircraft for defense-related technology development, $241 million for Canadian small and medium enterprises through the Defense Industry Assist Initiative, $161 million in quantum technology development for defense applications, and $28 million for a biomedical countermeasures initiative aimed at developing domestic capacity for vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments against biological threats. Melanie Joly emphasized at the podium that Canada's security depends on our ability to innovate at home. She stated, "We are strengthening our sovereign capabilities and supporting Canadian companies in the development of next-generation aerospace, drone, quantum, and biomedical technologies." The term sovereign capabilities is significant. While the emphasis is mine, the word is hers. This announcement represents not only a $900 million investment, but also the first tranche of something much larger. According to the Globe and Mail, Canada's full defense industrial strategy, released in February 2026, pledges $6.6 billion over 5 years. The stated goals include more than tripling Canadian defense industry revenue, boosting defense exports by 50% and creating 125,000 jobs over the next decade. At the 2025 NATO summit in The Hague, Canada committed to reaching 2% of GDP on defense this fiscal year, with a pathway to 5% by 2035. According to the government's own figures, the Canadian defense industry currently contributes nearly $10 billion to GDP and supports over 81,000 jobs. Now, the directive is to scale up quickly and do so without relying on Washington. That last point is crucial. Carney stated at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026 that more than 70 cents of every dollar of Canadian military capital spending would no longer go to the United States. This means that 70 cents of every dollar would be redirected away from the southern neighbor and into domestic producers, European partners, and allied democracies. In December 2025, Canada became the first non-European nation to join the European Union Security Action for Europe initiative known as SAFE. As reported by Al Jazeera and confirmed by Carney himself on social media, SAFE is a $150 billion rearmament fund that allows Canada's defense manufacturers to access European procurement programs, close capability gaps, and attract European defense investment into Canada. Carney described this as a game changer, while Europe characterized Canada's admission as unprecedented. Trade finance analysts noted that European business leaders were calling Carney a better European than we are at this stage. Let's pause here, as this is where the architecture of what is being built becomes visible. If you know how to interpret it, Canada is not merely reacting to a crisis, it is executing a plan. This plan has been in motion since at least the spring of 2025, coinciding with Carney's assumption of office and his first major international speech, which highlighted the rupture in the world order. He has made 26 trips abroad in his first year in office, spending 68 days outside Canada, 20% of his first year, building a network that now includes the following: a new strategic economic partnership with China, which reopened access to a $4 billion canola market and lifted discriminatory tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports, a strategic partnership with Qatar, a security and defense cooperation partnership with South Korea, a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Indonesia, a renewed strategic partnership with Chile, advanced negotiations with Mercosur, free trade negotiations launched with Thailand and the Philippines, a letter of intent with Malaysia regarding LNG and nuclear energy, a new commitment to expand the EU CPTPP bridge, potentially forming a trading bloc of 40 countries and 1.5 billion people. And just this week, Carney announced plans to travel to Bardo and Oslo, Norway, from March 13th to 15th to observe NATO exercise Cold Response above the Arctic Circle and attend the Canada-Nordic Summit. Read that itinerary again: China, Qatar, South Korea, Indonesia, Norway, Europe, the Arctic. This is not merely about trade diversification. It represents the creation of a parallel world, a network of economic, military, and technological relationships that bypasses Washington. It's a new framework for global order, and Canada is at the forefront of this shift. Now, let's examine what's happening on the other side of the border. To fully grasp why Canada is pursuing this path, it's crucial to understand the official statements made by the United States at the highest levels. On March 5th, 2026, while Prime Minister Mark Carney was in Australia, U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth spoke at the Americas Counter-Cartel Conference hosted by U.S. Southern Command in Doral, Florida. In his address to security officials from 17 nations, Hegseth declared that is why President Trump has drawn a new strategic map from Greenland to the Gulf of America to the Panama Canal and its surrounding countries. At the Department of War, we call this strategic map the Greater North America. He elaborated that every sovereign nation and territory north of the equator, from Greenland to Ecuador and from Alaska to Guyana, is not part of the global south. It constitutes America's immediate security perimeter. This statement is significant because it excludes Canada from being recognized as an ally, a trading partner, or a sovereign G7 democracy. Instead, it frames Canada as part of the U.S. security perimeter. Analysts, including those at Mohammed Daily Ali and various security think tanks, have pointed out that Hegseth's speech is not just isolated rhetoric. It reflects a broader doctrinal shift embedded in the Pentagon's January 2026 National Defense Strategy. This document, the first of its kind since 2022, introduces a concept called Homeland and Hemisphere, which explicitly expands the definition of the American homeland to encompass all of North and South America. As reported by the Daily Rumble, the strategy invokes the Monroe Doctrine and its Roosevelt corollary, which historically justified U.S. military interventions in Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. It promises credible options to guarantee U.S. military and commercial access to key areas, specifically naming Greenland, the Panama Canal, and the Gulf of America. This is not mere theater. It is doctrine officially written, published, and recognized. Furthermore, Trump has referred to Carney as his governor, treated the Great Lakes as if there were no border, and threatened to decertify Canadian aircraft, block the opening of the Gordie Howe Bridge, and scrap the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, the same agreement his administration negotiated during its first term. According to Patrick Lennox's analysis published in The Walrus, titled "Canada is Already at War with the U.S., We Just Don't Know It Yet," the Trump administration has shown a deliberate willingness to create chaos, not as an accident or dysfunction, but as a strategy designed to disorient and rewire perceptions of normalcy, making the unacceptable feel inevitable. Lennox identifies the central organizing principle of this approach as resource imperialism. Canada, much like Venezuela before its takeover or Greenland amid Trump's annexation fantasies, is being viewed not as a partner, but as real estate, resources to be acquired and territory to be absorbed. Effectively a 51st state in everything but name until that name changes too. This historical pattern makes the situation more understandable. Analysts who have studied Putin's approach to Ukraine prior to 2022 recognize this methodology immediately, denigrate the nation's independent identity in public discourse, undermine the legitimacy of its sovereignty at every opportunity, and create a fog of chaos through small provocations, medium insults, and large threats. Each of these actions may seem dismissible on their own, but collectively, they form a systematic campaign of psychological destabilization. Sound familiar? One Canadian observer tracking this since December 2024 stated plainly this week that what Trump is doing to Canada is not simply characteristic of Trump, it mirrors Putin's tactics. Same playbook, different target. Now let's delve into the deeper military implications that are being largely overlooked. The $900 million drone investment is not just a defense spending announcement. It is a strategic response to a new reality of warfare that the United States, despite its military power, entered into the Iran conflict without adequately addressing. Consider the lessons learned from the front lines of Ukraine. Warfare in 2026 is asymmetric in a manner that disrupts traditional cost calculations. Advanced air defense systems cost billions to build and operate. For example, Patriot missile batteries are extraordinarily expensive, with each intercept missile costing tens of millions of dollars. In contrast, Iranian Shahid series drones, which have been striking apartment buildings and power stations in Ukrainian cities and are now being utilized in the broader Middle East conflict, cost between $20,000 and $50,000 to manufacture, sometimes even less. This means you could be launching a $3 million missile at a $30,000 drone. Such a financial model is unsustainable over time. As retired Major General Dennis Thompson noted this week in the context of the Iran war, the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs reportedly warned the Trump administration that it could run low on munitions. The Patriot batteries being depleted in the Persian Gulf are the same systems that Ukraine desperately needs. Canada has had personnel in Ukraine not merely observing but learning from the conflict. The drone investment represents Canada's acknowledgement of the future of warfare. It demonstrates an understanding of the asymmetric threat and a commitment to not being caught in a defensive posture reliant on equipment it does not manufacture and supply chains it does not control. The Drone Innovation Hub in Ottawa and Mirabel is not solely about constructing drones. It focuses on counter-drone capabilities, autonomous systems, and dual-use technology benefiting both military and civilian operations. It reflects a country making a real-time decision that strategic autonomy requires industrial autonomy. Industry Minister Joly invoked history deliberately during the announcement, referencing the NRC's founding during World War I and its transformation of Canadian industrial capacity during World War II. From virtually nothing in 1939 to producing dozens of aircraft and thousands of motor vehicles weekly by 1943. She stated, "We've done it before. We can do it again." This is not merely budget language, it is mobilization language. If you work in aerospace in Ontario or Quebec, if your company is connected to Bombardier, if you supply the NRC, or if you are a Canadian developing sensor technology, autonomous systems, or quantum communications, this announcement directly impacts your industry. The Bombardier Global 6500 being acquired will be assembled at Pearson in Mississauga, with interior modifications completed at Cascade Aerospace in Abbotsford, British Columbia, involving over 65 Canadian suppliers contributing components. According to reporting from National Observer, these are real jobs and real investments being funded by a government that has decided defense is now also a matter of industrial policy. If you work in any sector reliant on U.S. market access, auto parts in Windsor, agriculture in Saskatchewan, energy in Alberta, this trade diversification narrative is relevant to you as well. Currently, 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. That level of exposure is not sustainable given the current geopolitical climate. The new trade agreements are not just about economics, they serve as insurance. They represent the slow, painful, necessary effort to reduce a dependency that has become a vulnerability. Let me take a moment to acknowledge the complexity of what Carney is navigating. This situation is not straightforward. There remains a serious question regarding Canada's actual involvement in the Iran strikes. The Department of National Defence asserts that no Canadian personnel participated in any targeting, but Major General Thompson's assessment contradicts that claim. Axworthy's challenge is on record, as is the fact that 18 Canadian Armed Forces members were embedded in U.S. operational headquarters, including the Combined Aerospace Operations Center where targeting decisions are made. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand instructed Canadians in the Middle East to evacuate the region with just hours of notice before the strikes commenced, raising further questions about what Ottawa knew and when it knew it. Axworthy's challenge cannot simply be dismissed with a press release. It demands a parliamentary inquiry. It requires transparency regarding what orders, if any, were given to those 18 personnel. It necessitates a serious national conversation about the implications of having Canadian officers embedded in a military command structure that acts without consulting Canada. Moreover, it calls for an honest assessment of the fact that, as Axworthy stated, you cannot integrate Canadian intelligence into a targeting process and then claim to have clean hands when missiles are launched. Carney's declaration of never in Parliament addresses future participation, but does not resolve the question of what occurred on February 28th. This tension will persist throughout the unfolding story. Now, let's outline the two potential paths moving forward. These are not merely possibilities. They represent two realities, one of which will become dominant based on decisions made in the next 90 days. The first path hinges on Carney's parliamentary declaration holding firm. The clarity it provides would allow Canada's alliances in Europe and the Indo-Pacific to deepen. Membership in SAFE would translate into real defense procurement contracts for Canadian manufacturers. The upcoming Norway summit could yield tangible commitments for Arctic security. Trade agreements with China, Indonesia, Qatar, and eventually India could create a genuine alternative market buffer, gradually reducing Canada's exposure to American economic volatility. The drone investment could evolve into a world-class counter-drone capability that NATO allies desire to purchase. Canada could establish a new equilibrium, not hostile to the United States, but genuinely independent of it, sovereign in the truest sense of the word. This path requires patience. It demands that Carney maintain domestic political consensus in a minority parliament where the Conservatives, Bloc Québécois, and NDP all have reasons to destabilize him. It necessitates that Trump does not escalate his provocations to a level that forces Canada into a direct confrontation it is not yet fully prepared to win. Additionally, it requires that the Iran war does not spiral into a catastrophic situation that overwhelms all other considerations. That last condition is uncertain. The second path involves the Strait of Hormuz remaining contested or closing entirely. This would lead to a spike in global energy prices to unprecedented levels, levels that could generate inflation, recession, supply chain collapse, and political instability simultaneously. The Iran conflict could expand, drawing in other regional actors. The U.S. military, which, as Thompson warned, may run low on high-value interceptors, could find itself in an operational quagmire it cannot exit without the naval capabilities of Canada, France, and the United Kingdom. It would turn to those allies, but Canada has already said never, France has called for de-escalation, and the UK is stretched thin. Washington, which has spent over a year treating its closest partners as resources to be extracted rather than relationships to be nurtured, now requires those same partners on terms they can no longer easily accept without betraying their own constituents. Meanwhile, Canada's economy, still 75% dependent on U.S. market access for its exports, faces a painful multi-year transition that cannot be expedited, regardless of how many trade agreements are signed. Real workers in actual plants in real communities will bear the burden of a geopolitical restructuring occurring faster than any industrial transition in modern Canadian history. This pain is real. It will not appear in trade strategy documents, but rather in layoff notices and plant closures in communities that invested in one economic future only to watch it reconfigure around them. There is no version of either path that avoids serious costs. The question is which costs are recoverable and which are not. Here's what I believe. When you strip away the daily political noise and examine the reality of what is transpiring, Carney is signaling to Europe, "We stand with you." He is communicating to the Canadian public, "I hear you." He is conveying to Washington that there are things that cannot be bought, leveraged, or threatened out of existence. Canada's sovereignty is one of them. The rest of the democratic world is watching, and the question is whether they are attentive enough to learn the right lessons before it becomes too late to act. Is the never sustainable? Is the trade diversification occurring quickly enough? Will the drone investment scale in time? Can Canada's military buildup keep pace with a 5% GDP commitment? The most profound question, which will define this decade, is this. When the dust settles from the Iran conflict, the Strait of Hormuz, and the greater North America strategy, which nations will have successfully protected their sovereignty, and which will have discovered too late that sovereignty is not a given but requires constant, deliberate, and costly effort to maintain? Canada is engaged in that work right now in real time. Whether it is sufficient and whether the pace is fast enough, the alliances are deep enough, and the industrial base is robust enough, that is the question this story will seek to answer over the next decade. And Sarah Mitchell's YouTube channel will be here to cover all of it. If this analysis resonated with you, please leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this information clicked for you, hit like. It helps us reach those who need to understand this story. Subscribe if you're not already with us and return for updates because the next move is imminent, and when it happens, we will be here to break it down.